Hi, my name is Rob Knight, and welcome to Photography Basic Skills. Today's video is going to be a tour of your camera body. If you're a beginning photographer or maybe you just bought a new camera, then this is the video for you. The more advanced our digital cameras become, the more buttons and dials and switches we end up with on our cameras. If you don't know what all these buttons and switches do, it can be daunting to try to handle a new camera. I'm going to be using Olympus OM-D cameras for my examples today. Your camera may have different buttons and dials, but most digital cameras have similar layouts or at least use similar icons. I'll also be demonstrating the difference between an entry-level camera and a professional camera. The differences can be subtle, but they're very important if you're looking to buy a new camera. Let's get started with the top plate of the camera. For my example, I'll be using the Olympus EM10 Mark IV, which is an entry-level camera. No matter what brand of camera you have, you're going to have a shutter release button on the top of the camera. This is the button that you press to make a picture, and depressing this button halfway activates your autofocus. The top of the camera also contains at least one command dial. Most cameras have two command dials, and your camera may have one of the dials on the back of the camera instead of on the top. These dials are used to control the aperture and shutter speed settings in manual exposure mode, or the aperture or shutter speed and exposure compensation in other exposure modes. Speaking of exposure modes, most digital cameras have a mode dial on top of the camera. This is used to select the exposure mode. You use this dial to switch between automatic mode, manual exposure mode, semi-automatic modes, movie mode, and other settings that might be specific to your camera. Somewhere near the shutter release button on the top of your camera, you'll find the movie record button. Generally, this button is smaller than the shutter release and will have a red indicator. Pressing this button will record a movie instead of taking a still photograph. Now, moving up to the Olympus EM5 Mark III, I'll show you some other buttons that your camera may have on its top plate. Many cameras have a dedicated button for exposure compensation. The exposure compensation button will have this symbol. You'd use exposure compensation to adjust the exposure brighter or darker when using the semi-automatic exposure modes. Moving to the left side of the EM5 Mark III, we also find a dedicated button to adjust the drive mode. This is how you change from single shot to multiple exposures when pressing the shutter release. On the professional EM1 Mark II camera, we find a dedicated button for autofocus modes in addition to the drive mode button. In general, a camera that's designed for professionals will have more dedicated controls on the outside of the camera body so that you don't have to go into the menu of the camera to change your settings. Another thing to note is the FN2 button. When you see a button on your camera marked with an FN, that means it's a programmable function button. As you get used to your camera, you may want to change the function of these buttons to better suit the way you shoot. I would recommend using the camera in its default configuration as you get used to it. If you start changing settings right out of the box, it can be very confusing for a new photographer. Also, pay attention to other markings that might be associated with the buttons and dials on your camera. For example, on the EM10 Mark IV, the rear dial has blue markings that indicate it can be used to zoom in to your photos in playback mode. Moving to the back of the camera, I'm going to go back to my EM10 Mark IV. Now, the two most obvious things on the back of any digital camera are the LCD, which is your big display monitor, and the viewfinder. The viewfinder on a mirrorless camera is also referred to as the EVF, or electronic viewfinder. An electronic viewfinder generally contains all of the information you might find on your big LCD monitor. The EVF is handy for checking the settings or playing back images in bright light when it might be hard to see the LCD monitor. Most cameras have a four-way controller that operates similarly to a joystick. You can see that the four-way controller on the EM10 Mark IV has markings to indicate what each side of the controller does. On this particular camera, the four-way controller allows you to control the ISO settings, the flash setting, the drive mode, and the autofocus point. The center of the four-way controller is the OK button, which allows you to finalize control settings and menu settings. And on an Olympus camera, the OK button also brings up the super control panel when you're in the shooting mode, so you can easily change most of your settings. The EM5 Mark III and the EM1 Mark II cameras do not have markings on the four-way controller since there are dedicated buttons for changing the ISO, drive modes, etc. On these cameras, the four-way controller is used to change the autofocus point. Other common buttons you'll find on most digital cameras are a menu button for changing the camera settings, a playback button for reviewing your image, and a trash can button for deleting images during playback. You will usually also find an info button. This button is generally used to change the information that is displayed on the LCD or in the EVF. For example, you may use this button to show or hide the histogram or other exposure settings while you're shooting. Most digital cameras have a button to lock the auto exposure and autofocus marked AEL AFL. This button is used to lock your exposure and focus on one thing before recomposing the photograph. For example, you may lock the exposure on the brightest part of the image so that you don't overexpose the highlights. Or you may want to lock exposure on the face of a person if you're making a portrait photo. On the EM5 Mark III and the professional level Olympus cameras, the AEL button is surrounded by a function lever. This lever can be used in two positions to save two different settings. For example, I use the number 1 setting for single autofocus and the number 2 setting for continuous autofocus. Many digital cameras like the Olympus EM1 Mark III and EM1X have a dedicated joystick to move the focus point on the screen. Some cameras also have an AF on button that can be used to activate the autofocus in addition to pressing the shutter release halfway. Most cameras also allow you to reassign the AEL button to activate the autofocus and act as the AF on button. The front of your camera is where you'll find the lens release button, and some cameras have programmable function buttons as well. The EM5 Mark III has one function button, while the professional level Olympus cameras have 2 or more. I know it can be challenging and it may be a bit confusing to learn a new digital camera, especially since cameras differ from brand to brand and even from model to model within the same brand. My advice is to take things slowly and concentrate on the settings for the exposure triangle and the autofocus first. Get the hang of these basic settings before you start worrying over the bells and the whistles. As I mentioned before, I also don't recommend changing a lot of the custom settings until you have time behind the camera to decide how you want to use it. It also might not sound like a lot of fun, but reading your camera's manual really can help. I usually download the PDF version of the manual to my phone or my iPad so I can use it for reference in the field. I know that tutorials like this and nerdy stuff like reading your camera's manual are not the most fun part of being a photographer. But the more you know about your tools, then the better you can use those tools to make whatever picture you want. So don't skip the basics, and I think you'll be happier in the long run. I appreciate you watching. If you need tutorials about the exposure triangle or other basics of photography, then stay tuned to this channel. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.